Well, key Republican figures are urging the incoming Trump administration to consider removing South Africa from U.S. trade agreements with Africa if the South African government maintains its current stance on Russia, China, Iran, and Israel. And I'm so happy to have Tony Carroll, a non-resident fellow in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Africa program, to discuss this today. Tony, welcome. And I see you've got a fabulous background there.
Yeah, I'm in actually one of the largest concentrations of South Africans outside of South Africa, Orange County, California, where you actually can get Bubudi and a good Chenin Blanc without walking very far.
Oh, wow. But why I'm so glad to talk to you is you are one of the architects of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Well, can you share a little bit of background what your role has been in that?
Well, it started in the mid-'90s when I was met with Jim McDermott, the real architect of AGOA, who was a congressman from Seattle, and like me, shared a strong background and interest in Africa, mine dating from my Peace Corps service in Botswana in the 1970s, late 70s. And Jim really wanted to try to accelerate ways in which Africa could be included in the global trading system. So we started, he was on the Ways and Means Committee, which is the originator of trade legislation in the Congress. And Jim decided to put together a task force, if you would, of like-minded people such as myself to try to sketch out what might be a preferential trade agreement that could benefit Africa and get Africa included in what was then and continues to be a growing international or interrelational trade environment, which it had been largely excluded from.
Wow, that's an amazing background to have, and especially for South Africans who are really AGOAs now on the agenda. Well, can we then look at Trump's trade policies and how it would affect Africa, well, and basically the rest of the world?
Well, we're coming from an era in the Biden administration which hasn't been particularly ambitious about trade to start with. So I think there's not going to be a huge shift. It's probably going to be a matter of more of rhetorical and perhaps emphasis rather than a complete 180 degrees switch. But clearly, Mr. Trump and many of his trade advisors, there was an interview this week with in the Financial Times with one of his trade advisors talking about David Ricardo is dead and the global free trade agreement that has governed largely trade relations for since the post-World War II era is now over. So Mr. Trump, President-elect Trump, is going to certainly have a much more cautious and much more anti-trade liberalization agenda to start with. Again, that's not terribly different than what we've seen from the Biden administration, but it will be in a matter of degree rather than a 180-degree shift. It will be a more, shall we say, cautious, conservative, if not critical, approach to trade agreements writ large.
Well, of course, there's now the influence of Elon Musk, which South Africans are also particularly interested in because he is South African born. He favors more of open trade. So, what kind of conflict would there be, or what kind of, how would that play out, do you think?
Well, we saw it played out in the recent discussions or debates on visas, which some of you have probably picked up, that the idea that we should open up our borders for highly educated people to come in the United States, and those in the anti-immigration agenda are pushing back. I think that's going to be a quality or characteristic that we're going to see going forward in the Trump administration, that you're going to see disparate views on important issues be sorted out in the confines of the White House and the National Security Council to sort out what is really going to be the end result. So it doesn't surprise me that you could get somebody like Mr. Navarro, who is a very much anti-trade person, versus Elon Musk, who sees the benefits of open markets and trade, sort of coming at loggerheads and then sorting out what might be almost the survival of the fittest, if you would, about who prevails in this type of environment. So I think it doesn't surprise me that you're going to see conflicting views within a Trump presidency. I think we've seen this in the past, and I think we'll see it again. In a way, sometimes, that might work out, that they sort of get two extremes and they figure out a middle position that sort of works best. It might not, but I mean, there is going to be a lot of sorting out, if you would, over these issues at very high levels.
So can we get to AGOA and specifically South Africa? Because there are these Republican senators who are quite keen to remove South Africa from it, although President Biden has now extended it to the end of 2025. So, what happens after that? Is South Africa in danger?
Well, let's first talk about AGOA. South Africa outside of AGOA doesn't matter if there's no AGOA. AGOA will expire at the end of this year if it's not extended. We've had several efforts, some of them at the very end of the last Congress, to try to put forth an extension of AGOA so that we're not again up at the border of the expiration of the agreement. And that, of course, is very much of a disincentive for investment. So if there's no guarantee or no assurance that there's going to be open market access to the United States under the AGOA plan, then investors are going to be very wary. Even exporters who aren't necessarily investors are not going to make the necessary decisions to be able to stage their exports to come into the United States. So without AGOA, South Africa's inclusion in AGOA doesn't matter. Right now, we're in a position where, given my earlier statements about an anti-trade liberalization philosophy that I think will be dominant, if not governing, it certainly will be influential in the next Trump administration. I think we're going to have to see whether Congress has the ambition to maybe even go against what might be something that would be viewed as antagonistic to the Trump administration, and have Congress move AGOA forward. Now, having said all of that, I had a conversation with the incoming trade representative designate, Jamerson Greer, and I specifically asked him about AGOA and whether or not the Trump administration would favor a renewal or an extension of AGOA. And the answer to him was, well, AGOA is, and this is true, AGOA has benefited greatly from wide bipartisan support in the past, both through its original passage and its extensions thereafter, and that the Trump administration would not necessarily view this as being, such a large issue that they wouldn't necessarily endorse or sign the bill. And I think we have to look at this in perspective. First of all, AGOA covers about 40% of Africa's exports to the United States. They amount to less than 1% of our total imports from the rest of the world. This is really a de minimis situation. It's hard to make a lot out of any domestic threat that AGOA could represent to any domestic U.S. industry. It's really hard to make that case that this is really a big deal. It isn't really a big deal when you look at the numbers. However, it means a lot to countries in Africa, and particularly South Africa, which we'll get to in a minute. So I think we have to try to keep some sort of balance here. I think the Ways and Means Committee, Chairman Smith is coming back as chairman, has indicated a preference or an indication of support for renewal or extension of AGOA. I think we're going to have a harder time with the new chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Brian Mast, who doesn't, shall we say, share some of the sentiments on global governance and shall we say, soft diplomacy that other chairmen of the House Foreign Affairs Committees have had in the past. So I think we're going to have a harder time to necessarily get their support for the bill, because the bill has two legislative originators. The Ways and Means Committee, which represents the sort of nuts and bolts of the bill, which is a trade bill, but also the conditions that govern in the inclusion of countries into the AGOA provisions are governed by the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So you really have to have support of both committees to get the bill passed. I think Ways and Means Committee, because of my de minimis point of view and the fact that it has enjoyed support over the years, will be in favor of passing a bill. I mean, there are some things that we can dust up and help improve on AGOA, which we could go into greater detail, but maybe we don't have the time to do that. But I do think we're getting a more critical view on the trade piece from the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And let me point out two things before we get to the South Africa issue. I think from what I heard from early off-the-record comments from some of the staff in the committee on the failure to pass the bill in the last Congress was, well, how does this impact American consumers? Well, the reality is it doesn't impact American consumers very much, because it's less than 1% of our imports. But we can make the case that South African assembled cars are cheaper, that, coffee from Kenya is better, cheaper, textiles from Lesotho are cheaper, and American consumers can take that. And moreover, we're not replacing American production. We're really replacing Chinese or East Asian production. And therefore, there's no sort of, negative impact on U.S. domestic production. And I think there's an issue of how is this competitive with China? And China has a market access agreement with Africa itself. It's much less liberal than AGOA. It's limited only to the least developed countries. It doesn't cover everything. And then the Chinese say one thing and might actually, in application, do something different. So the U.S. is really the sort of the golden market for South African and African exports because it is truly duty-free. But I think the upshot is that what is this in comparative advantage to China? And we have to make the case that this is a strong diplomatic and economic gain for our relationship, U.S. relationship with Africa. So we have to make that case in the next Congress, particularly to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I think the Ways and Means Committee will work its way through and try to see the importance of an AGOA extension. So that's sort of where we are in the landscape of AGOA. I think it's important to discuss that before we get to the issue of South Africa, because without AGOA, after 25, it doesn't matter whether South Africa is in or out. Everybody's out.
Well, if we just look at Africa, with the fact that China comes up in competition with China, the fact that we say, okay, that is actually a positive of AGOA, and rather trading with these African countries than China, that might actually be a good point to swing it towards Africa.
Well, that's exactly right. You hit the nail on the head here. We have to maintain this relationship, which is competitive with Africa. It gives us great opportunity to deepen our relationship. And we do other things such as PEPFAR. We are more ambitious on technology transfer. Americans bring, I think, better technology, better management practices. We employ more locals, lots of things that I think are on the good side of doing business with America. But, we also have our rough spots as well. We say we'll welcome all your imports, but when it comes to agriculture, you got to go through this additional process of getting approval from the agricultural, authorities to make sure that the products are safe and suitable and not going to infect U.S. production. I mean, there's a lot of complications in all of this, but I do think there is a both diplomatic and economic argument in our relationship with Africa to continue vis-a-vis China, the AGOA program.
Well, let's get to South Africa. Even if AGOA is continued, South Africa might have a problem.
Yeah, it will have a problem. I actually met with a former member of Congress and a former member of the Trump cabinet, and he knows my relationships with South Africa, and he himself has family relations in South Africa. And the first thing he said to me, he says, AGOA is in trouble and South Africa's in trouble. And I say, well, I know that. I hear that, in the last Congress, there are over 150 members of Congress who supported a out-of-cycle review of South Africa's inclusion in AGOA. Those congressmen largely and women are largely coming back, so they're going to have to be dealt with. So there is certainly, South Africa is threatened to be reviewed and then possibly excluded. Had that review been under a Biden administration, I think it's likely to say there would have been a more sympathetic review about South Africa. It shares many of my viewpoints that South Africa has a lot of things going forward positively. You've probably seen some of the stuff that I've written and testified on. But there are those I think in the Trump administration are going to be more critical about South Africa for many of those things that have been cited in the past. Its relationships with Russia, its stance on Ukraine, its leadership in the BRICS agreement, its relationship with China. And most pointedly, I think the issue of the ICC case in Gaza, which is the one that I think drove most of those signatures in Congress. I think we have to recognize that China is competitive to us all over the world, and that isn't just South Africa. We have that problem in Chile. We have that problem in Central Europe. I mean, it's and certainly in Central Asia. So, I mean, the South Africa is a writ large issue that I think transfers across all of our national relationships. I think that the issue on the ICC case in Gaza is the one that specifically has gotten the interest of those signatures in Congress and the incoming people that will be populating both the trade and the diplomatic teams within and the White House within the Trump administration.
So what could lobbyists for South Africa and South Africa itself do to try to, ensure that AGOA continues?
Well, if you're not, I think Woody Allen says 80% of life is showing up. I mean, we haven't really had much showing up by South Africa in Congress and in Washington in terms of making the case.
Oh.
I make the case all the time, but I'm not South African. I think that South Africa has a lot of positive points. I think you've had a successful election in May. Many things that South Africa has, features that are fundamental to its constitution in terms of the rights and privileges its citizens enjoy. Freedom of association, freedom of press. You have a functional economy. I mean, there are certainly a lot of weaknesses in that economy, but you have good markets, you have very sophisticated business processing services, you have investment that goes across borders. South Africa can be a driver of Africa economic growth. All of those things, I think, are very positive in terms of how we view and should view the South Africa relationship or situation. But you need to get out there and make those points. And as we probably know, we really haven't had much of a strong diplomatic footprint in Washington. I'm comforted that Ambassador Ephraim Rasool will be coming back to take over that position in Washington. He was a very able diplomat in the past. But I mean, you really got to be out there. And we haven't really had a strong presence in Washington to sort of make the good case that South Africa is important. Every once in a while, we'll get, a delegate from the South African government to come and say, don't take us off AGOA. And occasionally we've had a couple of ministers come. They've been successful visits. And then we have a periodic show up from business leadership. And that's all been very helpful. But a lot of this stuff is really in the battle in the trenches of really getting in and being there consistently and persistently, knocking on the doors and making the case in media, think tanks, business associations, on the Hill, within the administration, not only those people that make the decisions, but those that influence the decisions. And I'd say for the much of the team that I speak to that are more Republican leaning, I think the position is slightly negative on South Africa. And even in the sort of centrist community, it goes from being slightly negative to very negative. And I think that's really the only way to try to combat that is to try to get out there and really get boots on the ground and making the cases at this most frequent and often at the most sort of minuscule level to try to also engage those companies and associations that have business interests in South Africa to sort of weigh in and support South Africa, whether it be the automotive manufacturers, whether it be the fruit importers, maybe be the wine industry, what have you. I think there's a case to be made that South Africa is a good trading partner in the United States, that we benefit from it, and it's an important diplomatic relationship for us in Africa and beyond. So, and I think Mr. Trump has signaled also that he's very much the BRICS movement is in his crosshairs. I think South Africa's waving the flag and recruiting other countries to join the BRICS agreement is not going to play well, and I think that's a threat or a fear that I would take on board. I think, we have to recognize that we can't control all things, and the global international system hasn't worked well for everybody. I think there's an acknowledgement of that, even in the most critical circles. But I think the waving a flag and leading others to join BRICS is not one way, particularly on the currency front, by the way, is not way to win favors with the incoming Trump administration.
Well, I know that Mr. Ramaphosa spoke to the President-elect Donald Trump when he was elected, a very short conversation. And I also know that he's seen Elon Musk. So, how do they get an ear on the ground, or how do they actually get the Trump administration to listen to what South Africa has to say?
Well, I think Mr. Trump is very much driven by, transactional politics, and transactional politics for him seem to start at a person-to-person level. And I think that I was very pleased that there was I think a very favorable outcome from that conversation between the two presidents. And I think one thing that South Africa does have in its favor this year, a couple things it has in its favor this year. Firstly, it has the G20. President Trump has made an indication that he'd like to come. South Africa will be at a sort of pivot point globally on this larger discussion. I think that it'll be an opportunity, if you would, to engage at a very high level in preparation for that event. And since the President-elect Trump has indicated his interest in coming, then I think that's a good opportunity for the President Ramaphosa to build a relationship with Mr. Trump at the very highest levels, because I think that will signal to those people who don't like South Africa that, wait a minute, we have to rethink this because they seem to be getting along just fine. That is actually a part of, I think, the Trump, sort of profile, if you would, of personal-to-personal relationships. The other thing is South Africa's great golf courses. I mean, I think I know that sounds silly in a larger scheme of things, but, I think golf is something that really does get Mr. Trump excited, and South Africa does have a lot of really exciting golf courses. And I hate to say, we had ping pong diplomacy long ago. You may remember that, that was sort of the breakthrough in U.S. relations with China. And as we acknowledge now, the the death of Jimmy Carter, in this week and his burial this week, I think about those days. I'm old enough to remember that the beginning of the seeds of our relationship with China was really the beginning of ping pong diplomacy, as we called it. And to a certain extent, we can call this golf ball diplomacy. If there's an opportunity for them to talk about golf, then that's great. That's a point that they can agree on, and let's start there.
Yep, South Africa has had a couple of very good players, Ernie Els, and he has a wine farm as well. So, maybe that's the guy they should put forward.
And he's also fairly close to Mar-a-Lago, by the way. I know that for a fact.
There you go.
Neighbors, if you would. So I think there's an opportunity there to have a relationship through a very able diplomat for South Africa, Mr. Els. I've been to his golf tournament in Florida. He's a very big figure within the golf industry, and I think a great spokesman and diplomat for South Africa, in terms of certainly in the area of golf and wine.
So this is all up in the air. We're all speculating what's really going to happen. We sort of just look at patterns and how Mr. Trump operates. So, when will we know more definitely what the policy towards South Africa is going to be?
Well, I think we'll have to keep an eye on who's in charge. Right now we have, Mr. Rubio, Secretary of State, doesn't have a strong relationship with South Africa. He was critical of South Africa on the Israel issue, and I think that's not going to go away. So we have to deal with that. But I don't see him as being a particularly negative against South Africa incoming. I think we're going to have to work with that. But we don't know who the next tier of leadership will be within the State Department in terms of Africa yet. I mean, the names are percolating around, and I know some of those names, but I can't really at this point say who it will be. But I think that'll be helpful to find out. We'll also find out from the NSC, who's going to be running the NSC Africa desk. We don't know that yet, but we'll know that pretty soon. And then, then we'll see how it all transpires by taking a look at who's in charge. So it's a little early to tell. And also, we don't have the full committee assignments in Congress. We have the chairmen of the Ways and Means Committee, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee coming in, but we haven't designated the subcommittee leadership. And that's really where the legislation starts, and that's where some of this energy has arisen from the South Africa, anti-South Africa side. So we're going to have to see who's going to be in charge. But I don't think it's going to be all roses. I think South Africa's got to prepare itself here for having to beat back some criticism, fair or unfair, as that might be. I don't necessarily agree with the criticism in all of its manners and manifestations, but it is what it is. And we have to deal with the reality that there's going to be an uphill battle here to keep South Africa in AGOA and keep South Africa in a healthy relationship with the United States, where I think the second largest national investor into South Africa. So, we have 600 companies, U.S. companies working in South Africa. They represent a lot in terms of not only investment, but technology transfer, human resource development. I'm involved with a number of philanthropic projects in South Africa that are originated in the United States. We're working with one at Red Cross Hospital in Cape Town, another at Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto. So, there's a lot, and there's just many, many academic relationships that exist. University of Virginia is starting something with the University of the Western Cape. So there's a lot of engagement, if you would, at the academic, civil, and philanthropic level that I think is important to be calculated. And then lastly, let me say this, and I think it's important because I've also been involved with PEPFAR since its creation, is that the United States spends a lot of money in South Africa, I think close to $800 million a year. And without that, the backbone of South Africa's infectious disease management would be greatly jeopardized in South Africa. And I think, I think everybody recognizes the old adage, maybe biblically, that, doing good is its own reward. And I think that's true. But I think right now we need to give credit to credit for these type of initiatives to the United States and the people of the United States for spending the billions of dollars that we've had, again, doing the right thing. And there is a national security issue here as well. So it's not entirely for our, philanthropic interest, but it is really a very large commitment that we've made. And I think that's one thing that it would be helpful to get a little bit more credit for that from not only South Africa, but across the board for what we do. And PEPFAR is in danger as well. If we don't get PEPFAR extended through the next Congress, program will expire regardless of what the White House thinks about it. And that will be a tragedy because, again, a country like Lesotho gets 60% of its health care, at least in infectious disease management, from U.S. government funding. That goes away. Oh my gosh, what then happens? So this is really important stuff, and I'd like to urge, that we selfishly perhaps get a little bit more credit for that type of work. I think that'll be helpful.
Well, South Africa, keep on insisting it's non-aligned, but do you think it should dial down on BRICS, on Israel, on China, on Russia, on Iran?
Well, Ambassador Designate Rasul has indicated they're going to put down the megaphone, and that's a good idea. That's a good starting point. Let's not be the ringleader here. Let's sort of go along. I'm not saying South Africa should change its positions on non-alignment. I understand what they are, and I think there's strong reasons for that South Africa embraces, and I'm not going to take one side or the other on that. That's your decision to make, and I'm not going to dictate what your foreign policy or what South Africa's foreign policy's priorities should be. But I think putting down the megaphone, as Ambassador Designate Rasul said, is not a bad starting point. And I think that's probably one way that's going to keep South Africa from not being singled out as being the ringleader on some of these issues, which are going to be antithetical to the Trump administration.
Tony, Carroll, that was so interesting to talk to you, and we must definitely keep in touch to see what happens this year. So much is going to change. Thank you so much.
Well, it's great. I'm looking forward to myself being in South Africa in a few weeks at the Mining Endowment in Cape Town. So I hope to see many of my friends there, and I wish you all a happy new year. It's going to be a great year for South Africa, I'm hopeful, and the progress that has been made since the May elections is really, I think, encouraging, and I think we need to build upon that strength going forward. So all the best, and thank you very much for having me on today.